Okay, so let's switch gears here and we're going to talk about Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes series. And we're going to provide a brief introduction before our second reading. So he was a British author, but he was also a physician. And he creates the character of Sherlock Holmes in 1887. And the first story was called A Study in Scarlet. And it was the first of four novels. And he also wrote 56 other short stories about Holmes and Dr. Watson. The Sherlock Holmes stories are considered milestones in the field of crime fiction. Doyle was a prolific writer. Other than the Holmes stories, he wrote fantasy, science fiction, plays, romances, poetry, nonfiction, and historical novels. And historical novels was actually his real passion. So Doyle was born in 1859 in Edinburgh, Scotland. His father, Charles Doyle, was born in England of Irish Catholic descent, and his mother, Mary Foley, was also Irish Catholic. They married in 1855. In 1864, the family scattered because of his father's growing alcoholism. He was supported by wealthy uncles. Doyle was sent to England to a Jesuit preparatory school and then went to Stonyhurst College, which he attended until 1875. From 1875 to 76, he was educated at a Jesuit school in Austria. His family decided that he would spend a year there in order to perfect his German and broaden his academic horizons. He later rejected the Catholic faith and became agnostic. Later in life, he became a spiritualist mystic. Now, this is something that was very popular back then. People of like mind would gather together, sit around a table, maybe do something like the Ouija board, put themselves into some kind of self-hypnotic trances, and claim that they could communicate with the recently departed. Spiritualism made its way to America not long after. So back to Doyle's early life. From 1876 to 1881, he studies medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and he begins writing short stories there. He became a doctor, and his first job was on a whaling ship that went to Greenland in 1880. And this was, while he was still studying for his final doctorate of medicine degree. So after graduating with a Bachelor of Medicine and Master of Surgery from the University of Edinburgh in 1881, he becomes the ship's surgeon on a voyage to the West African coast. He partners up with a former classmate in a medical practice in Plymouth in England. But their relationship proved difficult, and Doyle left and set up his own independent practice. When he arrives in Portsmouth in 1882, he has about $10,000 to his name, and he sets up a medical practice. The practice was not successful, and while waiting for patients, Doyle returned to writing fiction. So let's talk a little bit about the life and times of Sherlock Holmes. 1881, President Garfield is assassinated, shot on July 2nd, as he walks through the waiting room of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad in Washington, D.C. His assassin had been rejected for a position in Garfield's administration. He dies a few days later. In 1881, the outlaw Billy the Kid was killed by lawman Pat Garrett in New Mexico's territory. And we talked a little about that in our other class. 1883, the United States modern American Navy begins. And these were the first modern warships that the Navy built. In the next 17 years, the Navy would go from being 12th to 3rd in size in the world. 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge is opened. May 25th, the New York boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn were linked with the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. The bridge was the first steel suspension bridge erected in the United States, and it cost about $16 million, and 26 lives were lost during the building. When it opened, the Brooklyn Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world. Again, in 1883, a volcano at Krakatoa erupts, blowing itself apart and throwing enormous quantities of volcanic dust into the atmosphere, which causes huge ecological problems for the world in terms of agriculture and weather in the Northern Hemisphere for several years later. 1884, Mark Twain publishes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. 1888, George Eastman patents a camera, a handheld camera, kind of bringing photography not quite to the general population, but we're getting there. 1888, Jack the Ripper's first victim is discovered in London. 1890, Vincent van Gogh dies in France at the age of 37 after shooting himself 2 days earlier. 1890, Sitting Bull, legendary Sioux leader, died at the age of 59 in South Dakota. He was killed while being arrested in the federal government's crackdown on the ghost dance movement. Again, in 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre takes place in South Dakota when U.S. cavalry troops fired on Lakota Sioux who had gathered. The killings of hundreds of unarmed men and women and children essentially marked the end of Native American resistance to white rule in the West. 1891, Carnegie Hall opens in New York City. 1893, the public are outraged when Arthur Conan Doyle published a story in which Sherlock Holmes apparently died. 1895, Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, arranged in his will for his estate to fund the Nobel Peace Prize. 1896, the first more modern Olympic Games are held in Athens, Greece. 1897, the Klondike Gold Rush began in Alaska, taking us back to Jack London. And in 1898, the United States declares war on Spain. 1901, President William McKinley is shot and he dies 8 days later. 1901, the first electronic typewriter. The phonograph becomes popular in the home. The first balloon Zeppelin flight, and the very beginnings of the automobile can be seen on the streets in major cities around the world. Again, not for the average citizen. And it is the very beginnings of radio. So that's a little introduction to Conan Doyle and some of the historic events during the time of Sherlock Holmes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what was life like in London during Sherlock Holmes' time. So pollution was huge, and it was a very smoky atmosphere that prevailed at all times of the year because of industrial activity and the sheer concentration of domestic fires. It meant that skin and clothing were quickly dirtied just by walking on the street. Atmospheric pollution caused by burning cheap, soft coal created the city's notorious pea soup fog. So that fog that you read about in London was not due to the weather, but due to pollution. There were a few electric street lights, very new. The two-wheeled hansom cab, which was first seen in 1834, was the most common type of cab on London's roads throughout the Victorian era. So if you wanted to get around, you hopped a cab, a horse-drawn cab, or you walked. They were starting a kind of subway system back then. The population density in certain areas made for a very unsanitary conditions and resulted in epidemic disease. The most serious of them in the poorer section of town was tuberculosis. In contrast to the conspicuous wealth of the City of London and Westminster, there was a huge underclass of desperately poor Londoners within a short range of the most affluent areas. During the first half of the 19th century, the shipbuilding industry on the Thames River was highly innovative and produced some of the most technologically advanced vessels in the world. Immigrants from England's previous colonies moved into London. During the 19th century, London grew enormously to become a global city of immense importance. It was the largest city in the world from about 1825 and the world's largest port and the heart of international finance and trade. So that's a little brief description of what was going on in London at the time. So let's talk a little bit about Sherlock Holmes himself. So Doyle struggles to find a publisher for his work. His first work featuring Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, A Study in Scarlet, was written in about 3 weeks when he was 27 and finally accepted for publication. Holmes was partially modeled on Doyle's former university teacher, Joseph Bell. Doyle's attitude towards his most famous creation was ambivalent. In November 1891, he wrote a letter to his mother saying, "I think of slaying Holmes and winding him up for good and all. He takes my mind from better things." His mother writes back, "You won't. You can't, you mustn't." In an attempt to deflect publishers' demands for more Holmes story, Doyle raises the price to a level intended to discourage them, but found that the publishers were willing to pay even the large sums he asked to continue the stories. As a result, he became one of the best paid authors of his time. In December 1893, to dedicate more of his time to his historical novels, Doyle had Holmes and Professor Moriarty plunge to their deaths together down the Rickenback Falls in the story The Final Problem. The public outcry, however, led him to feature Holmes in 1901 in the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles, which actually becomes one of his most famous novels. So he wants to kill off Holmes. The people in London rebel. "Hey, you can't do that. Bring him back," which he does a couple of years later. So again, these stories are written in like a magazine, weekly magazine, and they're not written completely. They're set out into chapters so that each week a new chapter is revealed. And as I said before, people back then in the factory or in the office during their break time would discuss the Sherlock Holmes stories and try to follow along with the detective and try to figure out who the bad guy was. Okay, so Doyle was an avid football player. He was a goalkeeper. He was a good cricket player, a bodybuilder, a boxer, a golfer, and a billiard player. And again, as we've said, Authors do write about what they know best or what they like, and Sherlock Holmes, I think, at every point except the golfer, is mentioned as part of the Sherlock Holmes trilogies and stories. Okay, so he serves as a volunteer doctor at a hospital during the Second Boer War in South Africa. He has a long-standing interest in mystical subjects. He was fascinated by the idea of the paranormal phenomena. And that came and went throughout his life, sometimes believing it, sometimes being a critic of it, then going back to believing it. He was friends for a time with America's famous magician, Harry Houdini. And he also had an interest in architectural design. He passes away at the age of 71. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the character of Sherlock Holmes and what makes Sherlock Holmes such a great detective fiction character. And he kind of provides something called the Holmesian art of deduction. And it's his most apparent strength in the Sherlock Holmes character in his ability to draw large conclusions from the smallest of observations and details. He has kind of a bohemian aspect to his lifestyle and personality. He has a deep understanding of human emotion and behavior. He has an inability to empathize. This is one pretty straight-laced character. He has the ability to block out useless information. In his real name in fiction was actually William Sherlock Scott Holmes, and he is the world's only consulting detective, a profession he created for himself. Originally, he was going to be called Sharonford. The name was altered to Sherlock, possibly because of a cricketer who bore the name. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Holmes, was a fan of cricket, and the name Sherlock appears to have stuck in his memory. By the way, Sherlock is actually a girl's name. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective, referred to himself as a consulting detective in the stories. Holmes is known for his proficiency with observation, deduction, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. It's not clear if Sherlock is rich, but he will need a decent after-tax income to live his lifestyle in modern London in 2016. That would cost approximately $10,000 American per month to live on his own, or about $7,000 a month living with Watson. He's in the high-end rent district. Details of Sherlock's life in Conan Doyle's stories are scarce and often vague. Nevertheless, mentions of his early life and extended family paint a loose biographical picture of the detective. A statement of Holmes's age places his birth year at 1854. His parents are not mentioned, though his ancestors were country squires, and he claims that his grandmother was sister to the French artist Vernet. Holmes' brother, Mycroft, 7 years his senior, is a government official. Sherlock describes his brother as the more intelligent of the two, but notes that Mycroft lacks any interest in physical investigation, preferring to spend his time at the Diogenes Club. Some Sherlockians to conjecture that he and Mycroft were orphaned young. Mycroft is apparently the only person allowed to disparage Sherlock's talents without arousing his temper. That older brother gets to say. Holmes says that he first developed his methods of deduction as an undergraduate. A meeting with a classmate's father led him to adopt detection as a profession. In his study in Scarlet, which we're getting to, Watson has just returned from Afghanistan as a wounded military officer. He's looking for a place to rent. Through a character named Stamford, a past classmate of Dr. Watson, who he meets in a bar, he is introduced to Sherlock Holmes. Watson, initially in the beginning, doesn't quite know what Sherlock does for a profession. And in the study in Scarlet, within the first probably 5 pages, Watson makes a list of Sherlock Holmes' strengths and weaknesses. So this is what Watson has to say about Sherlock Holmes. He knows nothing about literature, not much about philosophy, not much about astronomy. Watson even has to tell Sherlock Holmes that the Earth revolves around the sun, and Watson's surprised, you don't even know that. And Sherlock says, it's useless information. It has nothing to do with where I'm going or what I need. So thanks for the info, but I will quickly discard it. Watson goes further to say he is feeble in his knowledge of politics. In botany, he's well up on belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, but he knows nothing of practical gardening. He has a very practical but limited knowledge of geology, although he knows by the color of the soil where in London the soil comes from. He has a profound knowledge of chemistry. He has an accurate but unsystematic knowledge of anatomy. And he has an immense knowledge of sensational literature and appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the last century. He plays the violin well. He's an expert single-stick player, boxer, and swordsman. And he has a good practical knowledge of British law. His IQ is estimated to be about 190. Einstein's IQ was estimated to be about 165. It is clear from references to the university in The Adventures of the Glorious Scot and The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual, and to some degree The Adventure of the Three Students, that Holmes attended either Oxford or Cambridge University, although the question of which one remains a topic of eternal debate. In his last bow, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle mentions that Holmes retired to a small farm on the Downs 5 miles from Eastbourne, where he was living the life of a hermit among his bees and books. Located along South Downs Way is the tiny village of East Dean, where a cottage is memorialized as Sherlock Holmes' retirement home. Okay, so got a kind of a general background, a little bit about our man Sherlock.